All right. Welcome everyone. I'm sorry I'm late today. If I'm audible, please let me know. Rutuja, Pradeep. All right. Thank you. So we were talking about the Bhakti movement, है ना? Bhakti movement में we had already covered Nirgun Bhakti, and we were in the middle of covering Sagun Bhakti. Within Sagun Bhakti, we had discussed the various cults or sects, namely the Vaishnavite and Shaivite sects. Now, as in the case of Nirgun Bhakti, we also needed to cover the contribution of Shagun Bhakti and its limitations. ठीक है, तो बताइए क्या मेन कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशंस थे शगुन भक्ति के? First of all, while Shagun Bhakti was not as radical as Nirgun Bhakti was with the issue of caste, it still was able to have a mediating effect on the attitude, the social attitude towards the lower castes and women. दूसरा क्या important contribution है? Like Nirgun Bhakti, to some extent, Shagun Bhakti also represented a social protest against Brahmanical orthodoxy. And when we say Brahmanical orthodoxy, we talk not only about the rigid caste hierarchy, emphasis on ritualism, but also its associated adjuncts. For example, the support of Brahmanical orthodoxy for the institution of feudalism. ठीक है, अब feudalism के साथ जितने भी restrictions हैं उन सबको that was challenged by Shagun Bhakti to some extent. And thirdly, culturally, the Shagun Bhakti made very important contributions in the field of literature, in the development of regional languages, in music, dance, drama, painting, and architecture. as well. Since Shagun Bhakti supported the concept of idol worship, therefore it made a very important contribution to the continuation of the temple cult. And through temples, all these various art forms were supported. Further, in the case of music, the entire body of Hindustani music to a large extent owes its origin to the Shagun Bhakti movement. Okay? Fourthly, when it came to social integration, once again, Shagun Bhakti played an important role. Kaise? With the arrival of Islam, the society had been horizontally divided into two sections, the Hindu society and the Muslim society. Shagun Bhakti advocated for what kind of values? Values of exclusivism or inclusivism? Inclusivism. It stood for the universal values of love, toleration, mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and the unity of God. And thus, it served as a very important tool to breach the gap between the Hindu and Muslim societies. At the same time, due to its relatively progressive attitude in matters of caste and gender, it also served as an important tool to breach the gap between the vertical division of the society, right? So, Brahmanical orthodoxy के अंदर the society had been rigidly vertically divided among the different varnas, different caste groups, and different genders. So, it also can say reduced the vertical division of the society to some extent. Thirdly, by challenging Brahmanical orthodoxy and bringing religion as a popular faith to the unprivileged, to the underprivileged and marginalized sections, it also mainstreamed cultural activities that had traditionally been associated with religion. Till now, the process of cultural creation had largely been controlled by the elite sections of the society. That was no longer the case under the influence of social bhakti. So, the mainstreaming of popular culture to a large extent was done by Shagun Bhakti. And since a number of new classes and peoples who till now had been kept aloof from the process of cultural creation were introduced into this process, they began contributing to it. Okay? So, till now, various segments of the population which had not been participating in the process of cultural development, they started to do so. So are the social attitudes going to change towards these groups or not? Yes, because now not only these artists, these cultural personalities, but the groups that they represent, they are going to come to the limelight. They're going to come to the forefront. The social attitudes which had been against them were now going to start shifting. Okay? So this is one important development that took place. Further, by providing religious equality among all sections, including both men as well as women, Shagun Bhakti also provided the basis for the concept of social equality. Okay? So this is, in fact, when we say it reduced the vertical division of the society to certain extent, तो उसी का continuation, उसी का extension है, right? Now, although it had made a compromise with the concept of Varna and caste, especially when contextualized against Nirgun Bhakti, but it was still able to soften the attitudes towards the lower caste and women by introducing the concept of religious equality. Since religious institutions and religious ritualism had been the basis for social division traditionally in Indian society, by weakening the inclusivity of access to religious activities, it had also opened the social domain in a major way. And thus, while it did not directly seek to do this, it also brought about economic mobility. How? Occupation had for a very long period been controlled and regulated through the institution of Varna and caste. By weakening the basis for Varna and caste by introducing the concept to the introduction of religious equality, it also weakened the basis for the superstructure of caste and Varna based occupational division, thus bringing about economic mobility. And thus it weakened the basis of feudalism in India. ठीक है? By doing this, it contributed to the introduction of not only economic mobility but also social mobility, the growth of crafts production, trade and commerce, and even urbanization. ठीक है? And as it had played an important role in social integration, Shagun Bhakti also made a major contribution towards regional integration. कैसे? By increasing the popularity of similar cults across the length and breadth of the Indian subcontinent, right? So everywhere, the same gods are going to be worshipped, and this gave a common link, or this created a common link between people in different regions. So in Maharashtra and Gujarat, in Bengal and Rajasthan, even in UP, Krishna Bhakti, for example, emerged as a major common link, culturally speaking, between the people. By providing the common link of theistic bhakti. This process was further aided because of the support of Shagun Bhakti to the temple cult, and associated with the temple cult is the practice of pilgrimage. So people who till now had no reason to move out of their regions to visit another region for economic or political purposes now had a reason to go to other places for spiritual and religious purposes. Okay? So pilgrimage became an important medium of cultural and economic contact and integration between different regions. Okay? So while these are the positive contributions, Shagun Bhakti was not without its own set of limitations. क्या limitations थे? See, Nirgun Bhakti represented a radical protest against Brahmanical orthodoxy. Okay? Was the radicalism of Shagun Bhakti as high as Nirgun Bhakti? Nahi tha, right? So while Nirgun Bhakti had the real possibility of undoing or sweeping away the Brahmanical orthodoxy, what Shagun Bhakti achieved was to weaken, or was to make a compromise with Brahmanical orthodoxy. ठीक है? Especially in matters of caste and gender equality. Okay? By making this compromise, it allowed the practices of inequality on the basis of caste and gender to survive and flourish within the Indian society. Therefore, while progress in the right direction was made by Shagun Bhakti in matters of caste and gender equality, it was decelerated. Okay? Secondly, with the emergence of Shagun Bhakti, what happened to Nirgun Bhakti? It is not actually going to decline, but the possibility of Nirgun Bhakti becoming the main cultural and religious philosophy and movement of India, that was done away with. That was removed. Now, Nirgun Bhakti, in the real sense, represented a protest, represented a transformative revolution. And with the emergence of Shagun Bhakti, the popularity of Nirgun Bhakti became stagnant. Okay? Therefore, all the progressive reforms that Nirgun Bhakti could possibly have possibly have brought, they did not take place. So it also slowed down the progressive movement of Nirgun Bhakti. And these are the chief limitations of Shagun Bhakti. Is this clear? Now, very quickly, let us take some notes, right? Take down a question. Critically evaluate the contributions of Sagun Bhakti towards social integration and reform. Full stop. 200 words, 15 marks. ठीक है? Now, first, beginning with an introduction. How do you think we should begin our answer? करना क्या है हमको? मेन डिमांड क्या है? We have to critically evaluate the contributions of Shagun Bhakti towards social integration and reform. तो इसके positives बताने हैं, negatives बताने हैं. Strengths and limitations we have to point out with regards to these two things, social integration and social reform. कैसे शुरू करना चाहिए हमें? पहले थोड़ा बहुत शगुन भक्ति के बारे में बताना चाहिए. वी शुड प्रोवाइड द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ शगुन भक्ति. क्या बता सकते हैं? What should we talk about in the introduction with regards to Shagun Bhakti? What it was, very briefly. ठीक. Secondly, the time period when it appeared on the scene. Thirdly, उसके पहले कुछ बताना चाहिए. How it manifested, right? What were the forms that it took? सगुन भक्ति में अगर theistic cults promote हो रहे हैं, तो around which figures, which gods were they created? How did it manifest? And finally, जो अभी आपने बोला, its relationship with social integration and social reform. ठीक है, तो it is the link of Shagun Bhakti with social integration and social reform that we need to highlight. Following this, what should we talk about? हमने अपना इंट्रोडक्शन एंड कैसे किया है? बाय हाईलाइटिंग दिस लिंक. तो अब इसके बाद किसके बारे में बात करनी चाहिए? The contributions of Shagun Bhakti towards social integration and social reform. Should we talk only about the contributions of Shagun Bhakti towards social integration and social reform, और किसी और बात में भी किसी और बारे में भी बात करनी पड़ेगी? यहाँ पर केवल कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन बता देंगे तो काम चल जाएगा या फिर कुछ और भी बताना पड़ेगा? What do we need to do? Critically evaluate, right? So we need to highlight not only the positive contributions but also the limitations. So after having highlighted the contributions of Shagun Bhakti, next हमको क्या बताना पड़ेगा? Limitations. And having done that, we need to provide the final finishing touches to our answer. कहाँ पे करेंगे वो? In the conclusion. What is the note on which we should conclude our answer? देखो, अभी आपने कंट्रीब्यूशन बताए हैं सबसे पहले, फिर उसके बाद लिमिटेशंस बताए हैं, और अब आपको कंक्लूड करना है. तो यू हैव ब्रॉट द आंसर टू अ नेगेटिव आउटलुक. ठीक है, एट दिस पॉइंट ऑफ टाइम. अब क्या करना होगा? उसको रीओरिएंट करना होगा. कैसे करोगे? डिस्पाइट दीज लिमिटेशंस, डॉट डॉट डॉट. ठीक है, तो इस तरह से कि हाँ, it is correct that there were limitations, but the positive contributions of Shagun Bhakti towards the process of social integration and social reform can hardly be overlooked. तो उसको dismiss नहीं कर सकते हैं हम out of hand. ठीक है, तो that is how we can manufacture an answer. अब बेसिक इंफॉर्मेशन आपके पास ऑलरेडी है कि पॉजिटिव कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशंस क्या थे और लिमिटेशंस क्या थे. आंसर लिख सकते हो जाएगा अभी? ठीक है, लेट अस ट्राई टू आंसर दिस इन अ रैशनल मैनर. राइट डाउन. क्वेश्चन याद है ना? critically evaluate the contributions of Shagun Bhakti towards social integration and reform. Write down. Shagun Bhakti emerged as a major theistic cult and cultural movement in North India during the medieval age. Full stop. It stood for unyielding love and devotion towards a personal deity with physical qualities and attributes. with physical qualities and attributes. Full stop. Therefore, an important aspect of Shagun Bhakti, was idol worship. Was idol worship. Full stop. Shagun Bhakti primarily manifested itself around the regional variations and mythological incarnations of Lord Vishnu and Shiva. And mythological incarnations of Lord Vishnu and Shiva. Full stop. Shagun Bhakti was not simply a religious movement, but made critical contributions towards social integration and social reform as well. So in our introduction, have we addressed all these? What, when, how, and link between Shagun Bhakti and social integration and reform? हो गया ना? ठीक है. नेक्स्ट अब क्या करना है? Contributions को highlight करना है. Next paragraph write down, or you can give a subheading. Contribution of Shagun Bhakti towards social integration and reform. Towards social integration and reform. Write down. Number 1. Shagun Bhakti espoused, इस तरह से लिखो, ESPOUSED, espoused the values of love, toleration, mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and the unity of God. And the unity of God. And the unity of God. Full stop. Therefore, it played an important role. In integrating the horizontally divided Indian society by softening the attitude of orthodox Brahmanism, towards Islam, ठीक है. Next point, number 2. By weakening the rigid hierarchy of Varna and caste division, by weakening the rigid hierarchy of Varna and caste division, comma, Shagun Bhakti also played a major role in bringing about vertical integration of the Indian society. Vertical integration of the Indian society. Next लिखो number 3. By mainstreaming cultural activities, comma, Shagun Bhakti created an acceptable platform for cultural contributions from marginalized sections. Within brackets you can write lower castes and women. These are the marginalized sections we are talking about. From marginalized sections, lower castes and women. Full stop. With this, comma, the attitudes or the social attitudes towards these groups also began shifting in a progressive direction. कितने में 3 हुए? Number 4. Shagun Bhakti stood for the right of all individuals comma, irrespective of their caste or gender, comma, to receive spiritual nourishment and grace. Full stop. This concept of religious equality this concept of religious equality was extremely important, was extremely important for establishing social equality, for establishing social equality. Since most social divisions were based on religious slash ritualistic sanction. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट नंबर 5, नंबर 5 लिखो. by weakening the varna and caste based divisions, by weakening the varna and caste based divisions, comma, Shagun Bhakti also induced economic mobility, also induced economic mobility, full stop. Groups which till now were prohibited from leaving their traditional professions, comma, received the freedom to do so, full stop. Therefore, by introducing economic mobility, comma, Shagun Bhakti was able to provide for the economic upliftment of several marginalized groups, ठीक है, full stop. This also weakened the basis of feudalism, resulting in the growth of production, trade, urbanization, and improved social mobility, ठीक है, कितने हुए हैं? 5. नंबर 6, सगुन भक्ति by emerging as a major cultural movement provided the basis for regional integration of the Indian subcontinent. Full stop. It emerged as the common link between different regions by popularizing the same religious cult and practices in different regions. Full stop. This cultural integration was given a more tangible manifestation with Shagun Bhakti's support of idol worship and the temple cult. Since these practices were associated with the practice of pilgrimage. Which emerged as the basis for physical integration of different regions. Number 6. Number 7. As for social reform, comma, while Sagun Bhakti was not as radical as Nirgun Bhakti, comma, it did have a mediating effect on social attitudes towards women and the lower castes. Full stop. और इससे हुआ क्या? See, how did the Brahmanical orthodoxy react to Nirgun Bhakti? Completely hostile it was, right? Because both of these ideologies, both of these movements were diametrically opposed to each other. ठीक है? शगुन भक्ति ने क्या किया? It provided common ground between Nirgun Bhakti as well as Brahmanical orthodoxy, and thus brought this idea of social reform and traditionalism closer together. ठीक है? तो दोनों के बीच में एक मीटिंग स्पेस क्रिएट किया. Orthodoxy or the conservative movement, and this is social radicalism, right? So had it not been for this meeting place, what could have happened? The complete and permanent division of the Indian society. Take a disintegration of the Indian society. By providing this shared meeting space, it not only provided the basis for social integration, but Shagun Bhakti also brought the conservatives closer to the radicals, social radicals. Clear? And in this manner, also making the conservative position more progressive. Clear? Write down. हाँ, इसी में ही एक मिनट लिखा ना. In this manner, comma, to some extent, Shagun Bhakti was able to diffuse the hostility of the social conservatives and bring them closer to the progressives. ठीक है? Next, number 8, 7. Number 8. Further, comma, Sagun Bhakti represented the continuation of the social protest against Brahmanical orthodoxy. The continuation of the social protest against Brahmanical orthodoxy. Thus, intellectually, it shared the same relationship with Nirgun Bhakti as Mahayana Buddhism shared with original Buddhism or early Buddhism. Mahayana Buddhism shared with early Buddhism. ये point clear है? So Buddhism also represented a protest and reaction against Brahmanical orthodoxy, social divisions, rigid ritualism, etc., caste-based and Varna-based distinctions. But early Buddhism had started to lose its pace, lose its popularity among the people, because it does not believe in the concept of God, right, etc. And secondly, because of second urbanization, there was rise of material culture. Therefore, it was Mahayana Buddhism which re-energized the Buddhist movement in India, thus weakening Brahmanical orthodoxy further. निर्गुण भक्ति में भी वही प्रॉब्लम थी जो कि अर्ली बुद्धिज्म में था, राइट, दैट इट वाज नॉट एबल टू reconcile itself with the spiritual as well as material aspirations of the people. जैसे महायान बुद्धिज्म ने इसका सोल्यूशन निकाला, ये सगुन भक्ति ने यहाँ पे दोबारा से ये सोल्यूशन निकाला, ठीक है. सो फॉर शगुन भक्ति, the relationship between Sagun Bhakti and Nirgun Bhakti is the same as Mahayana Buddhism and early Buddhism in this regard. So it was able to keep the progressive movement alive and flourishing. Write down. Thus, comma, Sagun Bhakti was crucial for the survival and growth of the social reform movement launched by Nirgun Bhakti. Launched by Nirgun Bhakti. Number 9 you can write. Apart from social integration and reform, comma, Sagun Bhakti also made a major contribution to the growth of Indian culture. To the growth of Indian culture. Major contribution to the growth of Indian culture. Full stop. Due to its acceptance of idol worship, comma, Sagun Bhakti was easily associated with temple architecture. Full stop. Shagun Bhakti also emerged as an important facilitator of the growth of regional languages, literature, dance, drama, painting, and music. Both within and outside the temple courtyard. Both within and outside the temple courtyard. So these cultural activities, they were spearheaded by the temple cults, but they were also happening in the popular domain outside temples also. Folk music, for example, जो कि devotional है, folk paintings which is also devotional in nature, folk dances which are also devotional in literature, folk literature which is also devotional in nature. ठीक है? So both within the temple premises and outside the temple premises, Shagun Bhakti became an important facilitator of the growth of culture. ठीक? एंड इसका रोल क्या था इन द प्रोसेस ऑफ सोशल इंटीग्रेशन, ये हम ऑलरेडी डिस्कस कर चुके हैं पहले, दैट इट क्रिएटेड अ कॉमन लिंक, ठीक है, फॉर नॉट ओनली रीजनल बट ऑल्सो सोशल इंटीग्रेशन. राइट डाउन. With the growing popularity of devotional culture, with the growing popularity of devotional culture, comma, Shagun Bhakti provided a common link for social and regional integration. For social and regional integration. ऐसा हमने इसलिए लिखा है so that we can also align this point which is not exactly about social or religious integration with the main demands of the question. Demand क्या है? Contribution of Shagun Bhakti towards social and social integration and reform. तो हम उसके साथ इसको फिट कराने के लिए कल्चर को we have added this last sentence. Now ये तो हो गए the positive contributions. Now the limitations. Give the heading limitations of Shagun Bhakti. Write down. By accepting the caste division, and recognizing the temple cult, comma, Shagun Bhakti made a compromise with Brahmanical orthodoxy, and strengthened it. Full stop. Therefore, progress on the issues of caste and gender equality, slowed down. Next point, number 2. With its emergence, comma, Shagun Bhakti also deflated the popularity of Nirgun Bhakti. full stop. In this manner, comma, it unconsciously weakened the progressive movement associated with Nirgun Bhakti as well. ठीक है, तो ये हो गए लिमिटेशंस. एंड फाइनली कंक्लूजन करना है. ठीक है, कैसे करना है कंक्लूजन? Yes, there were limitations, but despite these limitations, the contributions of Shagun Bhakti to the process of social integration and reform cannot be easily overlooked or dismissed. Write down conclusion mein. Despite these limitations, the contribution of Sagun Bhakti towards social integration and reform cannot be overlooked. ठीक है. And what else can we link Sagun Bhakti with? Because it was providing the basis for social integration and reform. Social integration and reform is the first step towards national integration. तो हम उसको उससे link कर सकते हैं. So write down. Therefore, Sagun Bhakti created the social and cultural basis for the future process of nation building in the Indian subcontinent. Thus, it is significant not only in the historical sense, but also in the present day. So, the emphasis that we are trying to create is that Shagun Bhakti was a major upheaval and its effect, its resonance is still being felt today. The reverberations are still being felt today. ठीक है, तो ये हो गया the contributions of Shagun Bhakti. Now, in the Bhakti movement, a couple of more things we have to discuss. First of all, the association of women with the Bhakti movement. And secondly, the historiography of the Bhakti movement. ठीक है, तो पहले लिखो women in bhakti, women in bhakti and social protest. Women in bhakti and social protest. Now, there should be a question arising in your minds. क्या ये ठीक है, विमेन इन भक्ति तो हम डिस्कस करने वाले हैं, बट व्हाई एसोसिएटेड विद सोशल प्रोटेस्ट? क्या लिंक है दोनों के बीच में? Picture becomes clear if you think about the condition of women during the period in which Bhakti movement emerged. क्या किस तरह से ट्रीट करता था सोसाइटी वुमेन को? Did they have all the freedoms and privileges that women in India to certain degree have today? नहीं, right? So women were subjected to several restrictions. ठीक है? They were also forced to bear several social evils. The social attitude towards women was that they were subordinate to that of men. And not only that, but the individuality of women itself was under constant attack within the orthodox and closed Indian society. So they were heavily objectified. Objectification का मतलब क्या होता है? To treat a person like property. ठीक है? They do not have their own identity in this sense, and they are always going to be associated with somebody else. During the early medieval and medieval period, women were intrinsically associated with their male relations, for example, before marriage with their father and after marriage with their husband. They were considered to be the personal property of their husbands. So without their husbands, without their fathers, उनका कोई खुद का वजूद था ही नहीं, right? And this attitude is going to lead to practices such as sati, because after the death of the husband, what is the point of living on? That was the social attitude. Another attitude associated with this was, or another practice associated with this was a child marriage, right? Because the role of women in the society was by this point of time simply to produce children, to bear children, right? And as soon as they are ready and able to do so, marry them off, because women were seen as a burden, right? So for their family. So child marriage भी इससे associated था, poor treatment of widows इससे associated था, right? So these kinds of things were there. And in this scenario, the participation of women in bhakti was automatically a symbol of social protest. Take, write down. In medieval India, comma, the condition of women was extremely poor. Stop. They were subjected to several restrictions comma economic, social, religious, and political. Full stop. Subpoint. The general attitude towards women was that they were subordinate to men. Was that they were subordinate to men. Full stop. Next subpoint. Women were also heavily objectified, and regarded as the personal property of their fathers slash husbands, of their fathers slash husbands. Full stop. Next point. Next subpoint. This resulted in various social evils, such as child marriage, dowry, female infanticide, sati, the ostracization of widows, and ban on widow remarriage. Full stop. Next point, main point. Therefore, comma, the participation of women in bhakti was almost inconceivable. ठीक है? Next main point. As a result, comma, the emergence of female bhakti saints, represented a major social protest, since it violated social norms social norms with regards to women in a major way. In a major way. ठीक है, ना क्लियर है? नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो. डेविड किंग्सली asserts that it became impossible for women to reconcile their love for God with the drudgery of domestic life. With the drudgery of domestic life. ठीक है? Now, what had Bhakti done? It had taken religious pursuits from the priestly class and given it in the hands of the common, ordinary people. Right? That included not only men but also women. But within the confines, strict confines of the four walls of the household, they did not have the freedom to freely pursue their religious devotion. And thus, it was this bhakti which induced them to break the bonds of domestic existence, to move outside, come out of their homes. ठीक है? So that is what David Kingsley has asserted. क्या बोलता है ये? That it became impossible for women to reconcile their love and devotion towards God with the drudgery of domestic life. सब पॉइंट लिखो. Therefore, bhakti, by mainstreaming religious pursuits, was able to induce women to break the bonds of their domestic confines, and enter public life. And with regards to this, we have the example of 3 women bhakti saints, or 3 women bhaktas. कौन? मीराबाई, लालडेड और लल्लेश्वरी, and महादेवी अक्का, also known as अक्का महादेवी. ठीक है? मीराबाई का क्या कहानी है? She was a Rajput princess who was married off at a very young age to one of the sons of Maharana Sangha. However, she was widowed at a very young age as well. She was barely 15-16 years of age when she became a widow. And within a very short time, her father-in-law was also killed following the Battle of Khanwa. right? Following this, she faced a lot of domestic violence and abuse in her palace. And as a protest, क्या हुआ? She left the palace. Okay? What was the attitude of the women of Rajasthan towards Mirabai when she was alive? Did she did they accept her? No. They largely rejected her. She was a socially ostracized. She did not enjoy any social respectability. किन्होंने accept किया मीराबाई को? People from the marginalized sections, right? And thus, she found a common ally against the Brahmanical orthodoxy and patriarchy with other people who were feeling the same kind of oppression. Protest दिख रहा है? Yes. Lal Ded or Laleshwari. From where? Kashmir. Kashmir में she was associated with Shaivism. She was part of the cult of Shiva, right? Now, like the rest of India, the Kashmiri society was also extremely orthodox. और यहाँ पे not only Brahmanical orthodoxy but also Islamic orthodoxy was quite prevalent, and both of them had very strict and tough views with regards to women and their role in society. Now, her publicly becoming a Shaivite saint, her leaving her household, that was once again a mark of social protest. Secondly, at that point of time, there was intense hostility between Hindus and Muslims in Kashmir. Okay? So, because of various political and social reasons, दोनों के बीच में बहुत hostile attitude था. Now, Lal Ded, by emphasizing upon the qualities of peaceful coexistence and mutual respect, religious toleration, found a common ally in Nuruddin Rishi. In Kashmir, around this point of time in the mid 15th century, एक सूफी मूवमेंट इमर्ज हो रहा था known as the ऋषि मूवमेंट. ठीक है? These were Muslim Sufis, but they also adopted a number of yogic practices which they had learned from the Hindu yogis. They also emphasized upon the unity of God, the idea of peaceful coexistence, etc. ठीक है? तो एक अलायंस इमर्ज हुआ बिटवीन लाल डेड एंड नूरुद्दीन ऋषि. So not only did she represent a social protest with regards to the attitudes of the society towards women, she also represented social protest in the context of the attitudes that Hindus and Muslims traditionally had in Kashmir towards each other at this point of time. And Mahadevi Akka, she is associated with the Shaivite cult of South India. And in South India also at this point of time, Brahmanical orthodoxy had become entrenched. Women in South India were also subjected to the same kind of restrictions that women in North India were. And her very emergence as a Bhakti saint marked a social protest against Brahmanical patriarchy. Okay? She violated the norms within which women were supposed to remain confined, and thus encouraged the participation of more women to break or in the Bhakti field. So Bhakti, which had emerged as a religious movement, soon transformed itself into a protest movement, soon transformed itself into a social movement led by the marginalized sections, not only lower caste but also women. Clear? Write down. Next main point. The very emergence of women bhaktas represented a social protest against patriarchal orthodoxy. Full stop. In this context, the figures of Mirabai, Lal Ded, and Mahadevi Akka are especially prominent. Mirabai, Lal Ded, and Mahadevi Akka are especially prominent. Next main point लिखो. Mirabai are especially prominent. Mirabai, comma, a Rajput princess, was widowed at a very early age. And following the death of her father-in-law, comma, Maharana Sangha, comma, she was possibly subjected to domestic abuse. Stop. Subpoint. While she had been interested in Krishna Bhakti, since earlier, comma, she found it increasingly difficult to express her devotionalism in the environment of increasing restrictions. Okay? In the environment of increasing restrictions. Next point. As such, she had no choice but to renounce her life in the palace. And become a wanderer. Full stop. Next point. As expected, she faced social boycott and was ostracized by the Rajput society. By the Rajput society. By the Rajput society. Full stop. Next point. Her sense of loneliness. Her sense of loneliness is therefore reflected. Is therefore reflected. Loneliness is therefore reflected in her poetry as well. In her poetry as well. Next subpoint. On the other hand, comma, she found support. She found support from the lower castes. From the lower castes. Thus, strengthening the alliance against Brahmanical orthodoxy. Against Brahmanical orthodoxy. Next main point. Similarly in Kashmir, we find the example of Lalded or Lalleshwari. Lalded or Lalleshwari. Full stop. She also broke several social norms and emerged as a major symbol of protest. A major symbol of protest. Subpoint. Firstly, she violated the norm which restricted the participation of women in public life. In public life. Next subpoint. Secondly, she violated the norm of priestly domination. Priestly domination by rejecting the efficacy of religious ritualism. Of religious efficacy of religious ritualism and indulging in Shaivite bhakti as a matter of indulging in Shaivite bhakti as a matter of personal experience or as a matter of personal faith. Personal experience or personal faith. Next subpoint. Thirdly, comma, by establishing close relations with the Rishi Sufi movement, comma, she violated the norm of hostility and isolation between Hindu and Muslim societies. Between Hindu and Muslim society. Between Hindu and Muslim society. Okay. What do you want me to repeat, Prateek? You have to give me a hint. Which one do you want me to repeat? एक बार दिखाना. She also broke several social norms and emerged as a major symbol of protest. She also broke several social norms and emerged as a major symbol of protest. First subpoint, write down. Firstly, she violated the norms which restricted the participation of women in public life. Firstly, she violated the norms which restricted the participation of women in public life. ठीक है? Is it clear? All right. ठीक है. So this is how Lal Ded violated several social norms and emerged as a symbol of protest. Next main point लिखो. Mahadevi Akka similarly emerged as a symbol of women's protest against male dominance in Karnataka. Full stop. Subpoint. She violated the institution of domestic life by leaving her home and challenged priestly domination by rejecting ritualism and preaching in Kannada instead of Sanskrit. Instead of Sanskrit. ठीक है? So these are the, this is the role of women bhaktas. Clear? Next, the historiography of the Bhakti movement. So, regarding the nature of the Bhakti movement, there have been various opinions by different historians. Okay? And we need to analyze them. So, write down. Bhakti emerged as the largest cultural movement in Indian history. Stop. Almost every part of the country experienced it. Almost every part of the country experienced it. And it remained in force for over 1,000 years. For over 1,000 years. Thus, it would not be incorrect. Thus, it would not be incorrect to assume that bhakti became a core part of the Indian identity. Full stop. As a result, it is natural for there to be some controversy among scholars while specifying its nature. ठीक है? Now the different scholars. First of all, R.G. Bhandarkar. What has he linked medieval bhakti with? He has linked it with ancient Indian culture. And by doing this, he has emphasized that bhakti had indigenous roots And in this sense, it was a fully homegrown movement without any foreign influences. ये है सही? भक्ति के ऊपर कोई फॉरेन इन्फ्लुएंसेस या एक्सटर्नल इन्फ्लुएंसेस थे या नहीं थे? थे, बोथ इन द मेडिवल पीरियड एज वेल एज इन द एंशिएंट पीरियड, दोनों में ही था. तो देयरफॉर दिस पोजीशन हैज बीन रिजेक्टेड. राइट डाउन. इनिशियली नंबर 1 लिखो. इनिशियली आरजी भंडारकर while studying medieval bhakti, tried to link it to ancient Indian culture. Full stop. In other words, comma, he emphasized that bhakti had indigenous roots and was thus a fully homegrown movement. Roots. It had completely indigenous roots and was thus a fully homegrown movement. Without any external influences. ठीक है, तो एक हो गए आरजी भंडारकर. नेक्स्ट है नंबर 2 आरसी जायनीर. राइट. He has taken the exactly opposite position of Dr. R.G. Bhandarkar. डॉक्टर आरजी भंडारकर ने किससे लिंक किया मेडिवल भक्ति को? एंशिएंट इंडियन भक्ति से. और क्या बोला कि उसमें कोई फॉरेन इन्फ्लुएंस नहीं. तो आरसी जायनीर व्हाट इज ही गोइंग टू एम्फसाइज? दैट मेडिवल भक्ति इज द रिजल्ट ऑफ ओनली एंड ओनली foreign influences. So he has tried to associate it with the advent of Islam. ठीक है, write down. On the other hand, comma, R.C. Zainir has linked Bhakti with the advent of Islam. Full stop. He emphasizes that Bhakti as a popular movement emerged in India only after the advent of Islam. Full stop. Before this, it had remained primarily a philosophical movement. Now, is this position valid? नहीं, क्योंकि इसमें भी बहुत सारे generalizations assumptions हैं. First of all, he has generalized Indian history as a whole and South India की history को reject कर दिया है. In South India, from the 6th to the 9th century, Bhakti was a popular movement. Then he has also neglected many portions of ancient Indian history, जहाँ पे टेम्पल कल्ट इमर्ज हुआ था, जहाँ पे पॉपुलर था भक्ति मूवमेंट, एज अ पॉपुलर मूवमेंट इमर्ज हुआ था भक्ति मूवमेंट. फॉर एग्जाम्पल ड्यूरिंग द गुप्ता पीरियड. He has simply taken the history of India during the early medieval period, just preceding the advent of Islam, and in this manner he has tried to give the credit of the emergence of Bhakti as a popular movement to the advent of Islam. So it was in association, or it was due to the influence of Islam that Indians also adopted the idea that religion can become a popular cult, popular movement, and it was blind aping of this Islamic phenomena. Okay. Now, both these positions have largely been rejected, and it is in this context that a new position was taken by Yusuf Hussain. क्या बोलते हैं ये? That Bhakti should be perceived as having two distinct phases. Okay? The earlier phase of Bhakti, from the 4th, 5th to the 12th century, and then from the 12th century onwards. क्या emphasize करते हैं? That Bhakti was present during both these time periods. So he is arguing for a synthesis of R.G. Bhandarkar's and R.C. Zaini's position, and thus argues that during this period, Bhakti was primarily a matter of individual perception. Okay? So it was primarily a private thing, religion, right? But from the 12th century onwards, Bhakti emerged as an important popular movement as well. Okay? Having not only a spiritual but also a social emphasis. Write down. Yusuf Hussain has divided Bhaktiism into two phases, 1 and 2. Number 1, from the 4th, 5th to 12th centuries. 12th century, when Bhakti was an individual perception. 2, from the 12th century onwards, when Bhakti emerged as a popular movement and religious creed after interaction with Islam. Popular movement and religious creed after interaction with Islam. creed, a religious creed after interaction with Islam. All right. Then there are some classical Marxist historians such as Muhammad Habib. What are they going to link Bhakti with? With the class movement. ठीक है? और इंडिया में especially during the early medieval and medieval age, class was based on caste primarily. ठीक है? तो इसको कैसे देखेंगे भक्ति मूवमेंट को? As a note of protest from the marginalized classes, that is the lower castes. So it was a protest of the lower castes, which had a bad experience not only with Brahmanism but also with Islam. They were treated poorly by both these religious orthodoxies and thus turned towards bhakti as a refuge. Okay? So write down. The classical Marxist scholars such as Muhammad Habib, have tried to link bhakti with the desperation of the lower castes, Full stop. For them, it was a symbol of social protest. So point. On one hand, they were exploited by the upper caste Hindus, and on the other, they were treated with revulsion by the upper class Muslims. Treated with revulsion, REVULSION, a revulsion by the upper class Muslims. We'll stop. Next point. As such, they turned towards bhakti. Not only for refuge, but also for emotional support. ठीक है? और later Marxist historians such as Irfan Habib, what are they going to link bhakti with? किससे लिंक करेंगे? किससे करते हैं जो लेटर मार्क्सिस्ट हिस्टोरियंस हमेशा? विद द इकोनॉमिक ट्रेंड्स. ठीक है? विद क्राफ्ट्स एंड प्रोडक्शन. Write down. Later Marxists such as Irfan Habib interpret Bhakti in the context of craft, interpret Bhakti in the context of craft and caste. Crafts and caste. Full stop. Subpoint. He explains the popularity of Bhakti he explains the popularity of Bhakti on the basis that it normalized occupational mobility by breaking the bond between caste and occupation. Okay? Is this clear? And finally, there is one more position which says that Bhakti was none of these things. Rather, it was the reaction of caste ridden Hinduism or caste ridden Brahmanical orthodoxy against the rise of Islam. So they said that it was largely an elite-led movement, okay, dominated by the Brahmins, which they introduced in order to safeguard their way of life and their status quo, superior status within the society, while trying to address the challenge posed by the rise of Islam. Write down. Some other scholars have interpreted Bhakti as the response of the Brahmanical orthodoxy to the threat posed by the advent of Islam. To the threat, Brahmanical orthodoxy, to the threat posed by the advent of Islam. Full stop. They emphasize that medieval Bhakti was primarily a Brahmanical elitist movement. Designed to maintain their social superiority. Okay? These are the important positions. On the basis of these interpretations, क्या पता लगता है हमें? What was the specific nature of the Bhakti movement? आसानी से बोल सकते हैं? नहीं. In fact, generalizations are not possible at all. We cannot assign any specific nature to the Bhakti movement, and it was a polyphonic movement. So Bhakti was a grand tradition which meant different things for different people. At the same time, it had elite voices as well as marginalized voices. It represented Brahmanical orthodoxy as well as tribal culture. It had influence of Islam as well as Hinduism. It represented both male orthodoxy as well as women protest from the women. It represented the interests of both the upper caste as well as the note of protest from the lower caste. Okay, so write down. Considering the different views regarding the nature of the Bhakti movement, we realize that it wasn't uniform. Full stop. Rather, it was a polyphonic movement with sometimes contradictory elements. Full stop. Sub point लिखो. It represented both the elite and popular sentiment. Full stop. It assimilated both the Brahmanical orthodoxy as well as popular revolt. Full stop. In some cases, it stood for male dominance, while in others, it marked the note of women's protest. Full stop. Similarly, while Bhakti strengthened the position of the ruling class, it simultaneously represented a regional revolt against centralized power. ठीक है, मेन पॉइंट लिखो. Therefore, main point. Therefore, we must be careful. We must be careful not to make generalizations while defining the nature of bhakti. The nature of bhakti. ठीक है? Take down a question. Delineate the historiography of the nature of the Bhakti movement. In your view, how far is it correct to characterize it as a note of social protest? Question mark. 200 words, 15 marks. Do you get the question? Delineate the historiography of the nature of Bhakti movement. ये तो हमने अभी cover किया है. Second वाला portion, in your view, how far is it correct to characterize it as a note of social protest? So, what does the second portion of the question want you to do? You need to make arguments in favor of how it represented a note of social protest, but also make arguments against this. ये केवल एक नोट ऑफ सोशल प्रोटेस्ट नहीं था, इसके अलावा और भी बहुत कुछ था. ठीक है? सो दैट इज व्हाट यू हैव टू एड्रेस ओवर हियर कि नो जनरलाइजेशंस आर पॉसिबल. यस, in some respects it actually represented a mark of social protest, but in other regards it was also used as a tool by the orthodox hierarchy, orthodoxy, in order to legitimize and perpetuate its position. Okay? So it is a combination of different realities. It was a very widespread movement. It was a very long-lasting movement. It represented different things in different regions during different time periods. It had several actors who were all acting from various different motivations and all coming from different positions. ठीक है? So that is why भक्ति को केवल ये बोल देना कि it was a note of social protest and then ending the matter, that would be intellectual dishonesty. We need to appreciate Bhakti in its entirety. If we characterize it simply as a note of social protest, we are looking at Bhakti through a very narrow lens. Okay? So that is what we need to do. हो जाएगा अभी? ठीक है then. So if there are no doubts, I'll end this class now.